Kwame Nkrumah was a Ghanaian politician, political theorist, and revolutionary. He served as Prime Minister of the Gold Coast from 1952 until 1957, when it gained independence from Britain. He was then the first Prime Minister and then the President of Ghana, from 1957 until 1966. An influential advocate of Pan-Africanism, Nkrumah was a founding member of the Organization of African Unity and winner of the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet Union in 1962. After 12 years abroad pursuing higher education, developing his political philosophy, and organizing with other diasporic Pan-Africanists, Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast to begin his political career as an advocate of national independence. He formed the Convention People's Party, which achieved rapid success through its unprecedented appeal to the common voter. He became Prime Minister in 1952 and retained the position when Ghana declared independence from Britain in 1957. In 1960, Ghanaians approved a new constitution and elected Nkrumah president. His administration was primarily socialist as well as nationalist. It funded national industrial and energy projects, developed a strong national education system and promoted a Pan-Africanist culture. Under Nkrumah, Ghana played a leading role in African international relations during the decolonization period. Nkrumah's government became authoritarian in the 1960s, as he repressed political opposition and conducted elections that were not free and fair. In 1964, a constitutional amendment made Ghana a one-party state, with Nkrumah as president for life of both the nation and its party. He fostered a personality cult, forming ideological institutes and adopting the title of Osajifo Dr. Nkrumah was deposed in 1966 by the National Liberation Council in a coup d'état, under whose supervision the country's economy was privatized. Nkrumah lived the rest of his life in Guinea, where he was named honorary co-president. Kwame Nkrumah, the first Prime Minister, 1957 to 1960, and President, 1960 to 1966, of the Republic of Ghana, was the leader of the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain its independence. He subsequently became a leading figure in the campaign for the United States of Africa. Nkrumah was born on September 21, 1909, in Nkroful, Gold Coast. The son of a goldsmith, he attended mission schools at Accra and government training colleges at Achimota, 1926 to 1930, where he prepared to be a teacher. In 1935, Nkrumah left for the United States where he attended Lincoln University, 1935 to 1939, and the University of Pennsylvania, 1939 to 1943. A gifted student, by 1943 Nkrumah had earned multiple bachelor's and master's degrees in economics, sociology, education, theology, and philosophy. Then, in May of 1945, Nkrumah departed for London, England, where he studied as a Ph.D. student at the London School of Economics. While in London, Nkrumah held key positions in anti-colonialist and Black-nationalist organizations and authored controversial papers calling for African independence and unity. In 1945, Nkrumah co-founded the Pan-African Congress, which became an influential voice against colonialism in Africa. In 1947, Nkrumah returned to the Gold Coast and became General Secretary of the newly founded United Gold Coast Convention. However, in 1949 Nkrumah split with the organization over its political objectives and formed the Convention People's Party, CPP. During his tenure as head of the CPP, Nkrumah protested British rule and led numerous petitions for self-government. Imprisoned by the British in 1950 for his political activities, Nkrumah was released in 1951 when his party won the general election in a landslide victory. He subsequently was elected Prime Minister in 1952. As Prime Minister, Nkrumah led an aggressive campaign for independence and achieved it in 1957. 3 years later, he formed a new government, the Republic of Ghana. A devoted Pan-Africanist, Nkrumah forged alliances with both Guinea and Mali and sought to create a League of African States with its own government. To help achieve this goal, in 1963 he and other African leaders formed the Organization of African Unity. Choosing to remain neutral in political affairs outside of the African continent, Nkrumah initially gained tentative support from both the United States and the Soviet Union, receiving economic and technical aid from both countries. Vigorously suppressing political dissidents, Nkrumah almost immediately was branded a dictator by his political opponents. Then, in 1961, a firestorm of protest erupted after he appointed himself Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and absolute head of the CPP. Nkrumah subsequently outlawed all other political parties. In 1966, Nkrumah's government was overthrown by a coup d'état while he was on a trip to Beijing, China. Taking refuge in Guinea, Nkrumah spent the rest of his life in exile. He died in Bucharest, Romania on April 27, 1972. Nkrumah worked as a teacher before going to the U.S. to study literature and socialism, 1935–45. In 1949 he formed the Convention People's Party, which advocated nonviolent protests, strikes, and non-cooperation with the British authorities. Elected Prime Minister of the Gold Coast, 1952–60, and then President of independent Ghana, Nkrumah advanced a policy of Africanization and built new roads, schools, and health facilities. After 1960 he devoted much of his time to the Pan-African movement, at the expense of Ghana's economy. Following an attempted coup in 1962, he increased authoritarian controls, withdrew from public life, increased contacts with communist countries, and wrote works on political philosophy. With the country facing economic ruin, he was deposed in 1966 while visiting Beijing. The first African-born Prime Minister of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, was a prominent Pan-African organizer whose radical vision and bold leadership helped lead Ghana to independence in 1957. Nkrumah served as an inspiration to Martin Luther King, who often looked to Nkrumah's leadership as an example of nonviolent activism. The evolution of Nkrumah's power in Ghana, however, complicated relations between the two men. Just days after King's assassination, Nkrumah expressed disagreement with King's views on nonviolence. Nkrumah was born on September 21, 1909, in the British colony of Nkroful, on the Gold Coast. Although raised in a small fishing village, Nkrumah was educated in the United States. He received both his Bachelor of Arts, 1939, and Bachelor of Theology, 1942, from Lincoln University and continued his education at the University of Pennsylvania, where he received a Master's of Philosophy and a Master's of Education, 1942–1943. While in college, Nkrumah became increasingly active in the Pan-African movement, the African Students Association of America, and the West African Students Union. In 1945 Nkrumah played a central role in organizing the Fifth Pan-Africanist Congress. In 1947 Nkrumah's activism attracted the attention of Ghanaian politician J.B. Danquah, who hired Nkrumah to serve as General Secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, an organization pursuing independence for the British colony. However, ideological differences between the two men led Nkrumah to found his own party, the Convention People's Party, CPP, in 1949. Nkrumah and the CPP sought self-government through the nonviolent strategy of positive action. Much like King's nonviolent strategies, positive action employed the tactics of protest and strike against colonial administration. In 1951 Nkrumah and the CPP received a decisive majority of votes in Ghana's first general elections, and on March 22, 1952, Nkrumah became the first Prime Minister of the Gold Coast. It would be 5 more years before full independence was realized, and the Gold Coast became the self-governed nation of Ghana. Martin and Coretta King attended Ghana's independence ceremony on March 6, 1957, at the invitation of Nkrumah. King was impressed by Nkrumah's leadership and keenly aware of the parallels between Ghanaian independence and the American civil rights movement. While in Ghana, the Kings shared a private meal with Nkrumah, discussing nonviolence and Nkrumah's impressions of the United States. After returning to the United States, King explained the lessons of Nkrumah and the Ghanaian struggle in a series of speeches and sermons. In April 24th speech, King related a message from Nkrumah and his finance minister: "Our sympathies are with America and its allies. But we will make it clear through the United Nations and other diplomatic channels that beautiful words and extensive handouts cannot be substitutes for the simple responsibility of treating our colored brothers in America as first-class human beings. So if we are to be a first-class nation, we cannot have second-class citizens." King lauded Nkrumah's leadership through nonviolent positive action. Both men were inspired by the life and teachings of Gandhi. In a sermon entitled "The Birth of a New Nation," King said of Ghana's newfound independence, "It reminds us of the fact that a nation or a people can break loose from oppression without violence." As early as 1962, Prime Minister Nkrumah faced the challenges of nation building in the legacy of colonialism. Mounting economic troubles led to increased discontentment with Nkrumah, and Ashanti nationalism further threatened his presidency. King struggled to understand the growing criticism of Nkrumah's leadership, stating, "I'm sure President Nkrumah has made some mistakes. On the other hand, I think we would have to see the problems that he has confronted. It is not an easy thing to lift a nation from a tribal tradition into a democracy first without having problems." King, July 19, 1962. In 1966, Nkrumah was removed from power in a coup led by the Ghanaian military and police forces. In response to King's assassination in 1968, Nkrumah wrote, "Even though I don't agree with King on some of his nonviolence views, I mourn for him. The final solution of all this will come when Africa is politically united." Yesterday it was Malcolm X. Today Luther King. Tomorrow, fire all over the United States. Nkrumah died of cancer in April 1972 while in exile in Conakry, Guinea. Circle is an abbreviation for Kwame Nkrumah Circle, the biggest roundabout in Ghana's capital Accra and named after Ghana's first president. Half a century has passed since he was ousted in a military coup, but he remains a popular figure in Ghana and beyond to this day. Nkrumah was born the son of a goldsmith on September 21, 1909 in what was then the Gold Coast, a British colony. He was sent to an elementary school run by a Catholic mission and later worked as a teacher himself. Pursuing his dream of studying in the United States, this young man, of humble origins, crossed the Atlantic on a steamship as a stowaway. He lived and studied in the U.S. for 10 years. In the mid-1940s, he moved to Britain where he studied law. It was there that he became a passionate advocate of Pan-Africanism, of a strong and unified Africa. By 1947 he had returned to the Gold Coast, where he organized strikes and boycotts and formed the Radical Convention People's Party, CPP, whose party slogan was "Independence Now. Vision of a United Africa." In 1950, Nkrumah was arrested by the British and sent to prison. The CCP won the elections the following year by a commanding majority. Nkrumah was released from prison and asked to form a government. He became prime minister in 1952, but ultimate authority over the country still rested with the British governor. This changed in 1957 when the Gold Coast made a peaceful transition to independence. Ghana was declared a republic in 1960 and Nkrumah elected its first president. At the time, the country was the world's biggest exporter of cocoa but lacked plant and machinery for the industrial processing of its natural resources. Nkrumah found numerous state-run companies, launched the construction of a huge dam for the generation of hydroelectric power, built schools and universities and backed liberation movements in African colonies that had yet to achieve independence. Nkrumah, who described himself as a socialist and a Marxist, campaigned tirelessly for his vision of a united Africa with a single parliament. Unlike many other African heads of state, Nkrumah's primary concern really was the good of the nation, German political scientist Christian Kors said. Ghanaians, in particular the poor and underprivileged, revered Nkrumah as a messiah. They wrote hymns and prayers praising him. Politics was his life. He neither smoked, nor drank. Asked in an interview what he did in order to relax, he replied that he worked. He married an Egyptian bank worker, who he had never seen before their wedding day. She spoke only Arabic and French, neither of which Nkrumah understood. They had 3 children. Yet despite his popularity, Nkrumah was a lonely, suspicious, and increasingly embittered man. In a letter written to his British secretary Erica Powell in 1965, he said, "I suffer from intense loneliness which makes me sometimes burst into tears. Did I ever tell you that I married not for myself but for the presidency?" Authoritarian leader. His style of government turned increasingly authoritarian. In 1961, 1 year after independence, he introduced legislation which allowed the government to send people to prison for 5 years without trial. Being disrespectful of the president became a criminal offense. Nkrumah controlled the media and his party's influence extended into almost all civil society organizations. Nkrumah turned Ghana into a one-party state in 1964. The country's economic problems multiplied. Most of the 50 state-run companies were poorly managed and lost money. Many of Nkrumah's pet projects were huge buildings built to boost national prestige. They were hardly ever used. In Accra, he built a vast conference complex which was to be the seat of a future government of African unity. But in 1963, the newly founded Organization of African Unity, OAU, precursor to the African Union, rejected Nkrumah's visions of Pan-Africanism. The first AOU summit was held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, not in Accra. The price of cocoa on the commodities market dropped so steeply that Nkrumah was obliged to put up taxes. The cost of living spiraled upwards, driving angry citizens out on the streets. There were strikes. "We had to queue up at the stadium to get our ration of sugar," recalls Micah Key, a Ghanaian professor of politics. "The factories that Nkrumah built didn't work. We were expected to run before we could walk," he said. Political scientist Kors believes that Nkrumah's vision of transforming his country and the rest of Africa was eventually his undoing. If you wish to modernize a country, you have to persuade the people to go along with you. That is something which he forgot. Nkrumah wanted to turn Ghana into a modern state, but he wanted to do it too quickly. On February 24, 1966, Ghana's military staged a coup while Nkrumah was on a state visit to China. The coup plotters had the backing of the United States. Jubilant crowds greeted the soldiers on the streets of Accra. Nkrumah was granted asylum in Guinea where he was appointed co-president. He died in the Romanian capital Bucharest while being treated for cancer in 1972. There are statues of Nkrumah scattered across Ghana 50 years after the military coup that ousted him. A mausoleum was built for him in Accra and numerous streets bear his name. His face can be seen on stamps and banknotes. People had a number of years to sort of look back at the Nkrumah years and reassess what he did, but they are also looking at the achievements, or lack of achievements, of the various military and civilian governments that succeeded him, said Gerard Fuller, a U.S. historian and author of a book on Nkrumah. There is a statue of Nkrumah in front of the African Union's headquarters in Addis Ababa, belated recognition for a pioneer in the struggle for a united Africa. Thank you for watching this video.